really excited to be here. This lecture that I'm going to give today is actually part of a series about feminism, and it's called Feminism from Basics to Barbie, because we all know that Barbie was a phenomenon this summer. Biggest Halloween costume this year is Barbie, right? So my job today is to walk you through the basics of feminism and this concept of intersectionality. So the title of my talk is Intersectionality Explained: Why Feminism is About More Than Gender Equality. And for some of you, intersectionality might be a totally brand new concept. So I'm hoping to walk you through that today, give you some examples of how you can do that for your life. So feminism, what a word. As the United States has become an increasingly politically polarized country in the last decade, and especially in the last 5-6 years, right? Feminism is a word that has become charged and entangled in our public discourse again. In 2023, I wonder, what does feminism even mean to us, right? Who has the right to define it? What does it look like in practice? Who are its leaders? What should be its objectives? And do we still need it? Well, spoiler alert, I'm going to argue we do still need it, so hope that's not going to disappoint anybody, but in my mind, we do still need it, and I'll explain why. These are perhaps questions that have become more visible and pressing among Americans as we face a set of what I think are daunting and complex problems. So we know that Roe v. Wade has recently fallen. Pregnant people in our country no longer have the right to bodily autonomy in many states. The Me Too movement has highlighted just how pervasive sexual harassment and assault remain in our culture. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 has catalyzed a reckoning with police violence against communities of color, while some state governments around our country have made it illegal for students to read and learn about the history of racism here. Queer identifying children face increased bullying and harassment as laws around the country seek to ban them from affirmative health care, safe bathrooms, and youth sports. We face relentless climate crises that continue to damage infrastructure and displace vulnerable populations. Many Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Some face food and housing insecurity, as CEO pay has far outpaced the earnings of the average worker. Millions of Americans cannot afford their prescription medications. And according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, as recently as 2019, Americans collectively had $195 billion in medical debt. For your reference, that's the size of the country of Greece's economy. Okay? So big number there. So all of these problems up on the board here are big ones, right? They're deeply rooted in long-standing histories and systems of oppression. And I think that it's easy to feel kind of helpless and hopeless in their wake, but I want to capture in this presentation that these are all intersectional feminist issues. That is, they're issues that should matter to people who claim feminism. They're issues that can benefit from feminist attention, theory, and activism. And do not despair, because we have the tools, I think, to address these problems if we possess the political will to work together in coalition with an intersectional feminist lens to guide us. So I'm going to give you a little roadmap of this journey I'm going to take you on today. I'll begin the presentation by sharing some data. I know data is kind of boring, but it's important, on current perceptions of feminism in the United States. How do people feel about feminism today in 2023? Then I'll explain how, recycled myths and disinformation in our public discourse continue to shape cultural attitudes toward feminism and generate resistance to it. Next, we'll think about how should we define feminism and the consequences for how we choose to define it for ourselves. And finally, we'll look at the concept of intersectionality, what it means to be an intersectional feminist, and why our feminism should go beyond basic calls for gender equality. And by the end, I hope that you'll be able to engage in some self-reflection on how you will make your own feminism more intersectional in order to help your own communities. So, current perceptions of feminism in the United States. So in 2020, the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan fact tank that conducts public polling and demographic studies, randomly surveyed more than 3,000 adults in the United States. 70% of the people polled in 2020 agreed that feminism has done a fair or great deal to advance women's rights in the United States. And 64% agreed that feminism is empowering. These numbers would suggest that a majority of the American public has at least some positive associations with feminism, at least when it is framed as a movement concerned with women's rights. However, if we stop there and we don't scrutinize the data, we miss a more nuanced picture of what is actually happening on the ground. It's important to look at these data intersectionally. That is, we need to look more closely at the multiple identity positions of the respondents to see how their gender, political affiliation, age, race and ethnicity, and access to education all intersected to shape their views of feminism. So we'll look first at gender. Okay, so up here on the graphic, the green dots are for women and the yellow dots are for men in this poll. When comparing women and men, the Pew Center found in 2020 that in the US, women are more likely than men to find feminism empowering and inclusive, while men were more likely to find it polarizing and outdated. Notably, roughly 3 in 10 men, and on the bottom you can see that it says 34%, of men described feminism in the US as being outdated. Unfortunately, since the Pew Research Center only offered respondents the choices of man or woman in the survey, we don't know how trans and non-binary respondents view feminism because they were erased from the data set. So a more inclusive and intersectional study would offer a few more choices in that category of gender identity. Now, an even stronger indicator than gender for feelings about feminism was political party affiliation. When asked how far the country has come on gender equality, the gap between Republicans and Democrats that you see down toward the bottom there was much bigger than the gap between men and women. 76%, the number on the bottom, of Democratic or left-leaning respondents felt that the country has not gone far enough to achieve gender equality, while only 33% of Republicans and right-leaning respondents felt the same way. 17% of Republicans felt that the United States has gone too far to achieve gender equality, compared to just 4% of Democrats who felt the same. Furthermore, Democratic women were significantly more likely to label feminism as empowering compared to women who identified as Republican, 77% compared to 56%, which you can see at the top of this graphic. There were also differences in race, ethnicity, age, and education. So white adults were more likely than Black and Hispanic adults to associate feminism with negative characteristics. And Democratic women between the ages of 18 to 25 with at least a bachelor's degree were the group who most identified as feminist among all the people polled. However, coming in at a close second were women 65 and older who identified as feminists more often than women aged 30 to 64. So that's just kind of an overview of where we are and why it's important to look at this data set with closer eyes, right, with more scrutiny. So the reasons that people might reject feminism are many and complex. There's no one simple explanation for that. But I do think that a major factor in that is the circulation of myths and disinformation in the public sphere, especially online. In their text, Women's Voices, Feminist Visions, authors Susan Shaw and Janet Lee use the expression battered word syndrome, when they talk about how misleading and negative connotations have become attached to feminism and the women's movement. Now, in this phenomenon, the groups that stand to lose the most privilege in the face of women's liberation have worked over the years to discredit and negatively brand feminism, removing it from its most basic principles of equality, equity, and social justice. And these folks who propagate these negative views tend to recycle and disseminate myths that have actually been around for a long time, and I'm going to show you some of those. So first, there's the myth that feminists are angry or whiny women. I've been called this before, who exaggerate gender discrimination. And the issue with this myth is that it works to tone police feminists and delegitimize women's anger and feminist anger. If feminists are made to seem irrational and hysterical or incapable of controlling their emotions, then their concerns are not taken seriously and their subordination is normalized. As feminist and queer author Audre Lorde once said when reflecting on how to respond to sexism and racism, quote, "Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change." In other words, anger is a reasonable response to oppression and a productive force that can be translated into feminist action. We should not hide from anger when advocating for change. After all, in society, men's anger and grievances are often framed as valid human responses to social situations. As a case in point, we might consider recent confirmations to the US Supreme Court. Confirmation procedures in our country are very much public political spectacles, and they're governed by very different expectations for women's and men's behavior. As in many public settings, female candidates must control their emotions under intense questioning in order to appear professional, intelligent, and qualified, but also pleasant, non-threatening, and cooperative. Just consider how the American public would have reacted if these two scenarios pictured here for Justices Kavanaugh and Brown-Jackson had been reversed. Second, there's the idea that feminists hate men or want to be like men or wish to exercise or maintain power over men. This is a myth because feminism does not seek to eliminate gender difference or any other kind of difference for that matter. Rather, feminism seeks to recognize and challenge the power dynamics that stratify differences in a hierarchy that then shapes people's access to resources and their ability to thrive. So it's not about eliminating difference. Of course, this myth about man-haters is not a new one. If we look back to the early 20th century, when American and British feminists were advocating for women's suffrage, we find the same anti-feminist messaging in postcards, which we might think of as being akin to contemporary internet memes. Not many people send postcards anymore. Postcards featuring unhappy, overburdened men performing women's labor were quite frequent at that time, and their message was, be careful, the suffragists want a reversal of gender roles. They will abandon their children in favor of their own ambition, and they are here to effeminize men. On one hand, femininity is constructed in this propaganda as something dangerous for men because it's understood as weakness and subservience. On the other hand, masculinity was depicted as making women monstrous and undesirable for marriage. In this postcard, titled The Masculine Woman, the suffragist's face even mimics her dog's, So there's something animalistic about her wanting to obtain suffrage, a privilege that was reserved for men. And in this one, we can see that the suffragists have been fashioned into ugly or plain old maids, while in the background we see the slogan, "Down with man." Finally, the myth that I think I've actually heard most often is that we live in a post-feminist era, that feminism's time has passed, it's outdated, the work of liberation is done. Like narrator Helen Mirren cheekily says in her voiceover in Greta Gerwig's Barbie movie, quote, "Because Barbie can be anything, women can be anything, girls can grow into women who can achieve everything and anything they set their mind to. Thanks to Barbie, all problems of feminism and equal rights have been solved." This myth, of course, intended as a joke in the film, no doubt, is rooted in what a lot of scholars call bootstrap culture and the foundational story of the American dream, that everybody simply needs to, pull themselves up by the bootstraps and use their own self-determination to succeed in the United States. The thing is that this relies on a harmful ethos of individualism rather than a model based on community and coalition, where we must work together across and an acknowledgement of our differences to make life better for everyone. While it's true that feminism has made significant gains for some women in some circumstances, we'll see that there really is still a long way to go if we understand feminism to be a movement about more than just gender equality. So in 2023, how should we define feminism? Well, believe it or not, that's actually a hard question to answer because everybody has a different idea of it. There are so many different models, theoretical models out there for what constitutes feminism. So there's liberal feminism, radical feminism, transnational Black and Chicana feminisms. There's Marxist feminism, ecofeminism, lesbian and queer feminisms, and so many others that I didn't put up here. And I'm not going to go into the differences between all these models, nor am I here to prescribe to you which is the best model for you. Instead, I would strategically offer some brief thoughts from 3 widely recognized feminist scholars and authors who have tried to answer this question in ways that are accessible to the general public and whose books you might like to check out from your local library. So I'm going to start with Bell Hooks. So in her book, Feminism is for Everybody, Passionate Politics, Bell Hooks, who sadly passed away just a couple of years ago, defines feminism as, quote, "a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression." So with this definition, Hooks seeks to show that feminism is not about being anti-man. Rather, she makes clear that the problem is sexism, and feminism targets this entrenched system that socializes all people to espouse and reproduce harmful ideas about gender, men, women alike. She pinpoints the replacement of what were called feminist consciousness raising groups, which maybe some of you were a part of in the 60s, 70s, 80s, with the gender studies classroom on the university campus as one of the major reasons why people don't actually know a whole lot about feminism today or who might reject feminism. CR groups, consciousness raising groups, were non-hierarchical conversation circles that normally took place in people's homes or in places like public libraries. And it was a place where women gathered to voice their concerns, read and discuss feminist texts, and devise plans for activism. And Hooks laments that we haven't conserved that tradition today. Instead, she says that reading, talking, and learning about feminism have largely shifted to a privileged space, the university campus, which simply is not available to everyone. So she seeks a straightforward, accessible definition that will help folks come closer to feminism, to know it firsthand, rather than rely on secondhand, third-hand sources, which tend to circulate disinformation. At the same time, she also recognizes that feminism based on gender equality alone will not solve the complex problems that we face. We also need to work to end the systems of racism, class elitism, and imperialism. So not strictly, all about gender equality. The second model that I'd offer comes from a Nigerian author that some of you maybe you've seen the TED Talks that this author has given online, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whose novels, books, and TED Talks on feminism have been widely consumed in the United States, and who offers us a transnational perspective. So Ngozi Adichie has talked about her experiences growing up in Nigeria, and when she would tell people when she was growing up that she was a feminist, people in her country of origin often responded by saying that she was anti-African and that she had been corrupted by Western books. In her book, We Should All Be Feminists, she defines feminism as a movement seeking the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. A feminist, she says, is somebody who says, yes, there is a problem with gender as it is today, and we need to fix it. She talks about how feminism must address our socialization into prescriptive gender roles. And especially, she talks about how masculinity is too often a hard, small cage where boys and men are taught to fear emotion and vulnerability. Girls, in contrast, she says, are taught to cater to the fragility of men. Now, as many of my students rightly point out, there are always pros and cons to every model of feminism. No model is perfect. And a lot of times my students point out, fairly so, that the limitation of this model is that it does depend on a pretty rigid understanding of gender as strictly something that's binary or male, female, when in fact, because gender is socially constructed and historically and culturally variable, it's much more flexible than that, and it's understood much more flexibly in many cultures around the world. Okay? Now, the last model is one that personally resonates with me. This is one of my favorites, and it comes from Roxane Gay. Roxane Gay is an author, a professor, and a cultural critic who often writes for the New York Times. And she has this volume of essays titled Bad Feminist. It's a very suggestive title. And in Bad Feminist, Gay resists offering a singular definition of feminism, and that makes her model quite a bit different from the two I just showed you. She strategically makes the introduction to her text look like a dictionary entry that lists the meaning of feminism, a noun, as simply, quote, plural. It's the only definition she gives. Why does she do this? Well, she resists defining feminism because the moment we do so, we pin it down. We hold it to unreasonable expectations in our country. We evacuate it of some of its possibility. The moment feminism is branded and attached to high-profile public figures, which is often the case for movements for social justice, it comes in for heavy criticism when public figures stumble and make mistakes. After all, as Gay points out, feminism is flawed because it is a movement powered by people, and people are inherently flawed. It's just how we are. We're inherently flawed beings. Gay openly embraces the label of bad feminist because she's a human being who's trying to do some good in the world, but, she messes up like we all do. She describes herself, in fact, as, quote, a woman who loves pink and likes to get freaky and sometimes dances her ass off to music she knows is terrible for women, and who sometimes plays dumb with repairmen because it's just easier to let them feel macho than it is to stand on the moral high ground. Some of us probably have done that before, right? Yep. Myself included. As Gay says, we don't all have to believe in the same kind of feminism. Feminism can be pluralistic. There can be lots of kinds of feminism, as long as we care enough to work together in coalition to minimize the fractures that exist among us and to just get something done. I don't think this means that anything and everything counts as feminism, right? I mean, Gay highlights issues of choice, reproductive freedom, bodily autonomy, access to health care, equal pay, all of those things as basic tenets of feminism. And she points out that women of color, queer women, and trans women need to be better included in the feminist project. So indeed, there are people who have been historically silenced and abandoned by mainstream feminism. In the women's suffrage movement, right, back in the turn of the century, women of color were often subordinated in that movement, and women's rights became synonymous with white women's rights, as some suffragists advocated for literacy tests to keep Black women from getting to the polls. Transnational feminists, like Chandra Mohanty, pictured here, have pointed out that feminists in the United States and Europe, who have insisted on a concept that's called universal sisterhood, have tended to prioritize an agenda that helps white, Western, middle-class women, and often at the expense of poor women of color of the global South. And focusing on patriarchy as a universal experience without considering how that experience has also been produced through colonialism, through imperialism, advocates of universal sisterhood and feminism have erased how other kinds of difference work with gender to shape systems of power, occasioning different outcomes for different populations. Additionally, a lack of inclusivity around class, race, and sexuality spurred the development of Black women's studies in the 1970s. Lack of attention to disability generated the first text on feminist disability studies in the late 1980s and into the 90s. And people who felt oppressed by a rigid gender binary, who didn't feel like they fit into the categories of man or woman, catalyzed queer theories starting in the 1990s. So I think that one of the texts that best illustrates the dangers of looking at gender in isolation and not practicing inclusive feminism, it comes from Audre Lorde again, and it's titled No Hierarchy of Oppressions, and this is a text that Lorde wrote in 1983. Lorde, who identified as a Black, lesbian, socialist, feminist mother, talked about how she always found herself in some group in society in which the majority defined her as deviant, difficult, inferior, or just plain wrong. Within the lesbian community, she was always ostracized as a Black woman. And in the Black community, she was ostracized for being lesbian. So where is she supposed to belong? Any attack against Black people, she wrote, is a lesbian and gay issue because I and thousands of other Black women are part of the lesbian community. Any attack against lesbians and gays is a Black issue because thousands of lesbians and gays are Black. Lorde could not separate her lesbian identity from her identity as a person of color. She couldn't choose which part of her identity oppressed her the most and that was most in need of liberation. In other words, she couldn't separate and rank the different oppressions that she was experiencing and put them into a hierarchy. It just doesn't work that way. These systems operated on her simultaneously because misogyny, anti-Blackness, and anti-queerness are often linked discourses that all come from a desire to dominate an other in society. As an example of this, Audre Lorde cites a legal case that the Ku Klux Klan brought before the Board of Education in Detroit, Michigan in the 1980s to ban books that, quote, hinted at homosexuality. Some 40 years later, here are titles of some of the 50 most banned books in the United States during the last academic year. Today, folks who are seeking to ban books on queer identities are the same folks who are looking to eliminate books that address racism and sexism. They are linked discourses. Despite how much progress we've made in some areas, it does sometimes feel like we've kind of stood still, right? So, for these reasons, it's important that whichever model of feminism you decide is the best for you, you strive to practice intersectionality in that feminism. So, intersectionality, what is this? Well, this is a term that existed throughout the 1970s, 1980s in practice, but it was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is now a professor of law at Columbia. And intersectionality is really a framework for thinking about the world and its historical processes, for understanding how identity is built, how it functions, for approaching contemporary problems, and for performing social justice work in your community. It functions as a lens that acknowledges the multiplicity of people's identities. People are never just one thing, right? And it stipulates that we all inhabit a unique social location at the intersection of many different systems of power and oppression, or isms is what I tell my students to remember them by. I'll think of the isms. So, systems like sexism, homophobia, racism, xenophobia, classism, ableism, Islamophobia, there are many others, right? These all come together, they intersect in a complex web. And the way that each one of us is positioned in that web, that very messy web, impacts our subjectivities, our experiences in the world, our access to resources, our physical and mental health. The systems interlock, right? That's where the name comes from, that they intersect or interlock. And they work together rather than separately or in isolation. And they reinforce or magnify each other's effects. In any given context, a particular aspect of your identity and a particular system of power might become more salient than others, and the privilege that you receive from one system of power might mitigate some of the oppression that you experience because of a different one, okay? So that's kind of a theoretical overview, and that's a lot of fancy words, but what does all of this really mean in practice, right? What does an intersectional feminist analysis look like? Well, there are lots of different social issues that we could apply this to, but I think we can consider the fall of Roe v. Wade, because that's very present in everybody's mind, right? So we can think about how should we approach recuperating Roe v. Wade and reproductive justice more broadly as an intersectional feminist issue. Well, according to a map on the New York Times that came out a while ago, but it was last updated just a couple weeks ago, 21 states around our nation have banned abortion, or they've restricted the procedure to earlier in the pregnancy than the standard that had been set by Roe v. Wade. There are a few other states that aren't showing up here in bold, like Iowa, Montana, Wyoming, and Ohio, where bans for now have been blocked in courts, right? And we're not sure what's going to happen, but it's very likely that those are also going to turn up in bold on this map. It should not surprise us that when pregnant people don't have access to abortion, they experience much higher maternal mortality rates, even in states where there are exceptions for cases of rape and incest, severe fetal anomalies, or conditions that pose danger to the life of the pregnant person. Doctors are turning away patients in those states, not because they don't want to help, but because they don't know how to interpret purposefully ambiguous laws, and they fear criminal prosecution. Today, given the wide availability of abortion pills, deaths likely aren't going to come as botched back alley procedures, but instead from delayed medical interventions that lead to or exacerbate preeclampsia, hemorrhage, infection, and pre-existing conditions for pregnant people. As these bans have ramped up over the past few years, and during a global pandemic no less, the maternal mortality rate in our country dramatically increased. According to the National Vital Statistics System, the maternal mortality rate was 17.4 per 100,000 live births in 2019, so that's the blue column at the far left. Then it went to 20.1 the following year, then to 23.8 in 2020, and then it jumped up to 32.9 in 2021. However, when we look further into the data, what do we see? we find that not all populations face the same adverse outcomes. In 2021, non-Hispanic Black pregnant people had a maternal mortality rate of 69.9, which is the highest, the tallest column that you see there, compared to just 26.6 for non-Hispanic white pregnant people. This disparity in outcomes should not be tolerated by feminists. It would be easy to think that this difference here is due to different levels of income and lack of health insurance, but the intersectional reality, when you get down to it, is just much more complex. In January of 2023, a groundbreaking study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that even the wealthiest Black pregnant people were twice as likely to die as the wealthiest white pregnant people. That's to say, the advantages of social class and income did not appear to mitigate the risk of maternal mortality for Black people in the same way that wealth protected white patients. You'll notice here, for instance, on the right, that infant mortality saw a general decrease for white patients as their income went up. But on the left, we just don't see that for babies born to Black patients. So what this means, I think, is that solutions for achieving reproductive justice have to take a hard look at misogyny in intersection with racism. Lots of factors converge here to create poor outcomes for pregnant people of color. In states where there are abortion bans, white people and people of higher social class are more easily able to navigate the healthcare system since they have greater health literacy. They can more easily get abortion pills to end their pregnancies. They can more easily secure appointments in abortion-friendly states. They have the funds to take time off work. They're not going to lose their job if they take a day off. They're still going to be paid. They can arrange for childcare. They can more easily drive or fly to another state to get help. Racism and implicit bias in healthcare mean that Black pregnant people are treated differently from white pregnant people, with their concerns not being taken as seriously, not being offered the same timely interventions in their care, especially when they're treated by white providers. Overall, more OBGYNs of color are needed. Representation is important. We also need more midwives of color. Air pollution in Black communities, lack of access to affordable nutrient-dense food, and everyday stress from experiencing racism have also been factors that contribute to worse outcomes in pregnancy. And additionally, solutions should look to rebuild trust in the healthcare system, given that Black women have suffered a long history of abuse at the hands of physicians and scientists, ranging from forced sterilization to medical experimentation without informed consent. We should also support, as intersectional feminists, a universal healthcare system that does not tie ability to access care to one's employment. Restoring Roe v. Wade will not be enough to close the gap in maternal mortality, and feminists would do well to remember that poor people of color lost the ability to access their constitutional right to abortion long before the fall of Roe, since the Hyde Amendment of 1977 barred the use of Medicaid funds to finance abortions. So intersectional feminists should do all of these things, and they should work to eliminate the Hyde Amendment in addition to restoring the protections of Roe. So this is just one example. I could go on, but I'm not gonna. We need intersectionality in our feminism because when we analyze gender all by itself, we don't get adequate solutions to complex problems. We silence and erase people who are oppressed by multiple systems of power, and we center solutions that tend to serve folks who are white and middle class. And before I close, and this is my last slide, I promise, I want to leave you with some suggestions because you're like, well, that was a Debbie Downer. She went on for a long time about all these problems. Well, so what should we do, right? Number one, I think if you want to practice intersectionality in your everyday life, you have to make sure that you're engaging in constant self-reflection. This means closely looking at the kinds of privilege you have, how you might be contributing to and reproducing systems of power, and I include myself in this, right? I think it's easier to recognize when we feel oppressed as human beings than it is to come to terms with our own privilege, because privilege works to conceal itself from the people who have it. Second, we gotta practice radical empathy and decenter our own perspectives and identities. And this means listening to people who are not the same as you, listening to learn, absorb, and reflect, and not just to respond or retort. When women of color or women with disabilities or people who are trans or non-binary are talking about their anger, pain, frustration, those of us in other communities should try not to tone police and should avoid steering the conversation to us and our needs and our frustration. And we shouldn't accuse folks of ever being aggressive or divisive to the cause. Third, working in coalition with other movements to do more than just gender equality, building partnerships with folks that are working on trans rights, awareness for disabilities, Black Lives Matter, people who are advocating for humane treatment of migrants and refugees, for example. Coalition is about marginalized communities coming together with the shared self-reflective commitment to stopping, ending, undermining oppression. 4, embrace vulnerability in your feminism. Be willing to screw up. That's what I tell my students. It's important that you try. You're gonna screw up. People are gonna correct you, okay? But when somebody corrects you, try not to become defensive because they're giving you their time and energy and their love to try to tell you, hey, I think you can do this better, right? And we should thank them for that and learn from it and grow from it. And finally, learn to sit with discomfort. Remember, intersectional feminism is not here for anybody's comfort, including mine, and growing always inevitably involves moments of discomfort, and that is completely fine. Okay. Thank you so much.
I think we do have some time for questions. No. Leslie, look like you're halfway up.
Well, okay, I'll throw it out there.
Okay.
So, looking at all this, and I'm an old feminist, we used to have Republican feminists and Democratic feminists. But now, looking at this, there's just feminists on one side of the aisle, it feels like. How do we get over the other side of the aisle to make things happen?
Yeah. Wow, if that isn't $1 million question, I don't know what is. It's very difficult given how incredibly polarized our country has become, right? I think a lot of people, myself included, have been having a hard time with this and have lost relationships because of this, including with members of our own families. But I guess what I would say is to keep the conversations going. I think when it's easy to get really frustrated when it seems like we can't even agree on what the problems are. But I think continuing to have those hard conversations, even if you feel like you're getting nowhere, and again, I go back to the radical empathy. Nobody is responsible for any widespread cultural belief, right? These are parts of systems of power. And so it's very easy, I think, to get wrapped up in the blame game and to see individuals as responsible for some of these ideas and some of this, disinformation and mythic ideas about feminism. But remembering that those have been around for a long time, we've seen this before, okay? Many of you in this room have fought these battles before, right? And just to think of them as being a recycled discourse, I think makes it seem more doable, if that makes sense, right? We've done this before, we've done hard things before, and we can do them again. It's unfortunate that we have to do them again, right? Let's be clear. But I think being willing to keep the conversation going. Yeah, because remembering that these are systemic problems, right? And we have new things today. We didn't have the internet, right? Those years ago when we were fighting those hard problems. And I do think that the internet's brought us a lot of great things. It's, done a lot for community building and activism, but at the same time, the internet is an incredible force for spreading myths and disinformation. So I think, thinking about your politics and accountability for media, I think is important, right? Labeling and rejecting, information online that is racist, that is sexist, right? And that is, quite frankly, false, that we need to continue to do that. Yeah. Got a mic here.
Oh, there we go.
Following up on that same question, you had some information in there that broke things down into men and women, ages, and political affiliation. But what I would be interested in is all of the above. Is there some way to break out, are younger people, no matter what their political affiliation, more likely to fall one way or the other? Or, that kind of thing, because I think that's where the nuances become really important.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you aggregate the data and you look just at age, I think, Gen Zers, my students over at Augustana, right, are leaning more into social justice work than any other generation is right now. But again, that's not a uniform thing either, right? And you see that in the classroom. You see people on all ends of the political spectrum, and that has just so much to do with where the students are from and the political affiliation of their family, but not always. I guess what I lament the most is that my age group is falling behind on feminist activism and identifying as feminist. I'm in the second category on the age scale, and I'm outpaced by the 18 to 25-year-olds, and I'm outpaced by the pioneers who are 65 and older, right? And I would like to see more intergenerational work, and I think ageism is a system of oppression as well that colors our political public discourse, and that that sometimes makes that kind of work hard. But I always get really jazzed by student organizations that reach out to the community and try to work across those boundaries, right? Because I think there's something to be said about that. There's a reason why, women between 25 and 65 are not identifying as strongly as feminists. So what happened? Is it that they're taking the gains of feminism for granted, that they don't know the history, right? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I think a bit of everything. But I think that's where coalition has to come into play, right? And coalition is not easy, right? We're governed by identity politics, where we have movements focusing on one kind of identity, different kind of identity, and they don't often always work well together. And that's unfortunate, right? And so, I would encourage folks that are, involved in like the Women's March, right? Think about other movements for social justice that you might partner with, and you might find yourself working with a different generation, right? And what can we learn from that? And how can we take those tools and diffuse them in society? It's not easy work, right? But I don't know, I guess that's how I envision it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
At the national conference, Linda Lake, they saw some punchy numbers on issues, and it kind of caught them off guard. So your team went down deep into the numbers, and they were shocked when you did abortion polling that it typically hit 2%, and since Dobbs, it's pushing to 74, 5%, and even like pink states. And they found that the book bans had no support. It was going across generational lines, blue state, green state lines, and it got even more worse. And they also saw something bizarre, that the MAGA base, which needs non-college white people, that is slowly shrinking. That non-college white women under 40 are seeing that, oh, my clinic is closing. Oh, what happened to I can't, what? Huh? What? And that group it's not happening overnight. But she said that little by little, it's having that effect that, yes, it does affect you. And the click is happening ever so slowly.
Right. Yeah. I think to myself, and the reason that's precisely why I shared those data, right? That 60+% of people actually find feminism empowering. The majority of Americans support Roe v. Wade in some shape or form, right? Some with some exceptions made, right? Some in all cases always, right? So there is some diversity there too. But I think it's important to remember that the loudest voices don't always represent what the majority is thinking, right? But it's very easy in this climate, I think, to get really bogged down by by the loudest voices, right? But they don't speak for all of us, right? Or for the majority of us. And so that's always something when I tell my students, actually a majority of Americans, according to many different kinds of polls, support access to abortion care in this country. And they're always a bit floored by that, some of them. And it's because it's not what they've been hearing, right? Again, the internet, right? And we sort of exist in echo chambers sometimes, right? We only hear the same ideas over and over. So I think, the loudest voices aren't always the majority. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, if you go down one slide where you talk about the age breakdown.
This one. No. Let me see here.
Maybe it was another. Wherever you have the age grouping.
Here it is,
Yes.
right?
So what I find really fascinating about this is the middle groups, the 30 to 64 age groups. What's fascinating to me is those are people that are raising children. And when you sit there and you look at a world in which your daughter or your son is going to grow up in, you want to make sure that they don't have to fight the same battles that you had to fight. I mean, I remember my grandmother was a raging feminist, which is probably why I am too, but I mean, I just remember the battles that she would fight, and here I find myself fighting the same ones for my daughters and my granddaughters, and for me it's fascinating that age group does not, and I know they're busy raising kids and everything, but you talk about loving your kids, protecting your kids, doing the best for your children, and feminism is a way to make sure that your daughters achieve equality or as close to it as you can get so that they aren't fighting the same thing every generation.
I promise you that my son, who's 9, knows what feminism is and has frequently commented on feminism in his classes at elementary school. But yes, that's such an important point. We need to address that, right? We need to think about what's going on there, right? Why is that age group disavowing feminism or not coming close to feminism, teaching their children about it? Again, I think it's just a lot of negative branding in the media, unfortunately, because some studies where, they introduce a definition for feminism based on, equality and, rights for both sexes, right? People who had said, no, I don't believe in feminism without the definition, when feminism is taken out, and instead, in its place, I support equality for all people or for the sexes, right? All genders. Then they say, oh yeah, that's me. Well, then where are you then? I mean, right? That is what feminism is, right? In its most basic tenets, right? But somewhere along the way, that's become delinked, right? And we have to work again to weave that back together. Yeah, and it's unfortunate that we have to do that.
Well, we hate to leave you waiting for more, but the good news is we're going to give you more. So we invite you to come back next week, the week after, and the week after that. But I think we got off to a great start. If you agree, would you help me thank Dr. Jennifer Heacock-Renaud?